Okay, thank you. Let me get my video on. Yes. Thank you very much. Oh, am I on video? Thank you very much. My video keeps coming off.
Yeah, right.
Thank you very much.
Now you are. Yes, sir.
And maybe you should forgive Mark and think about him that he's a relative of mine. So maybe he would say good things of me. I wanted to speak this morning about the proposed agreement between Nippon Steel and U.S. Steel, for Nippon Steel to purchase U.S. Steel and move its headquarters to U.S. Steel in Pittsburgh. What I may say may sound a bit like me blowing my own horn, but I hope you find it interesting nonetheless and worth reflecting on. Our bauxite operations in Guyana, with which I worked from 1967 and have been engaged with on to this day, makes a material that is a constituent of high temperature bricks for iron and steel furnaces. Brick makers were our direct customers, and brick makers had to be close to the iron and steel makers. So as a result, we got kind of attached to iron and steel making around most of the world at the time. No doubt, at the end of the World War II, U.S. Steel would have been a leading steel company in the world. U.S. Steel had grown up on the large taconite ore reserves in Minnesota. But over 1969 to 1981, U.S. Steel had built maybe the largest production area in 3 phases for about US $3 billion in that time, in the money of that day, which may be what, 12 to 15 billion dollars today. And that plant was totally shut down, however, in 1981, just 2 years after it had been completed. And what was the cause? One is, and maybe the main one was that much cheaper ore had been found and developed in Brazil. And later on, Australia came on board, supplying a lot of iron ore to steel makers in Japan and China. My company came into contact with U.S. Steel on 2 accounts, from 2 directions. Firstly, as a customer, directly and indirectly. I think U.S. Steel had a brick-making operation. And secondly, about 1984-85, the World Bank, IMF, granted a consultancy to the engineering and consultant subsidiary of U.S. Steel to provide assistance to our failing bauxite operations. As iron and steel in the West, and maybe around the world, ran into trouble, our operations also ran into trouble. And so U.S. Steel was given this contract to assist us. I recall touring some of the U.S. Steel operations in Minnesota and its headquarters in Pittsburgh and its campus-like R&D center at Monroeville, a bit outside Pittsburgh. One of the historical pieces of pride there was the first electron microscope. And as I recall, it was built in a column about 2 to 3 stories tall. I don't know what an electron microscope is like today. Haven't been around them for a long time, but I guess it may be just 1 or 2 suitcases today, but that was the first. It was the beginning, and U.S. Steel was very proud at the time, having built the first electron microscope. You may recall that in the 80s, Japan was riding a broad wave of better performance in many areas of production, manufacturing, motor cars, electronics, steel. And in steel and iron production, Japan was definitely taking the lead in the 80s in things they call continuous casting and electric arc furnaces and things like that, producing cleaner steel, which led to higher strength steels and alloys. And that was reflected in the kind of machinery that they were producing. In fact, early in the 1980s, US Steel was already being forced into downsizing. And that is how their experience, they had to release various amounts of experienced and expert persons, and they put some of them in this group called the engineering and consultant subsidiary that offered services to other companies like us. But I recall the leader of the UEC in Guyana saying to me, when your job is to close down different shops and departments, as they were doing then in US Steel in the 1980s, it does not take you long to realize that when you would have closed down your last shop, you would have also closed down your job. As we recall in the 1980s, Japan was booming in many areas, and many non-Japanese were wondering and asking why and how Japan is doing so well and looking for some unfair practice. The general Japanese response was that we have the same issues as you have. We have the same knowledge as you have, but we respond to them or treat them differently. Your society seems to have accepted or been prepared to live with the idea of a constant, never-ending struggle between workers and owners, managers. We have gone 2 stages beyond this, of ending conflict between workers and managers in the enterprise, and then between the enterprise and the society as a whole. And it is because we are at this stage now where our enterprises are aiming to produce the best products for society that we are now doing well at the world stage. But we now realize that we have to make another adaptation. We have to move forward one more, and our companies must become good for the world. And you might have heard sometimes some of the companies that had that in their slogan, good for the world. And so they said, it should not be surprising if a non-Japanese heads one of our big Japanese companies, and also in time, a Japanese company may move to another country, and we in Japan would be happy to have founded that company. And so when this story came out, it struck me that here it is, that what was being said in the 1980s seems to be coming to pass. In terms of non-Japanese heading Japanese companies, you would, some of you may know that for quite a while, Sony was headed by an Englishman, and Nissan, more recently, maybe 10 years ago, there was the big story about the Brazilian Frenchman who had been heading Nissan and what happened after that. So I think that this story now of Nippon Steel offering to purchase US Steel and moving its headquarters to Pittsburgh is instructive, but maybe it's something we should take note of. I think generally the world is moving more or less in the direction of one world, one human race, but our last maybe so many years, 20,000 years, was to identify ourselves as different, living in our own areas and different. And over the time, we had different physiological appearances. We evolved different physiological appearances, different languages, cultures, histories, and so a challenge of working our way through those differences and realizing and becoming one world, one human race. I think that there are quite a lot of good trends going, whilst a lot of conflict remains to be resolved. There's quite a lot of good trends, I was reading an article there about ISS, the International Space Station, that a number of nations, including the US and Russia, originally the USSR, got together and they have maintained that facility at great cost and lots of collaboration and cooperation, even though we have the presence of the Ukraine war at the moment, the Russia-Ukraine war at the moment. So there are many trends that we would get through this area. It seems that conflict may be increasing over the next 50, 100 years, points of conflict, but I think that, and I hope that we would get through it. So thank you very much. That's my presentation today, and I think it's maybe appropriate for the name of our group as the Rotarian Club of All Nations. Thank you much. And I'm